300 years ago, the most powerful street in the world was not a street at all. It was a wall. An actual wall. Sharpened logs, taller than a man, sunk into a ditch that ran clear across the island from one river to the other. It was dug by enslaved Africans and Dutch colonists, and it was built to keep the world out. This is the colonial town of New York, around the year 1700 AD, barely 5,000 souls. And in a single century, this one strip of ground would change its skin 4 times and end up holding the price of everything. The whole story is still here, buried under your feet.
I'm Arthur, and we're going to dig it up.
So forget the towers for a moment. Stand instead on a strip of bare ground at the edge of a small Dutch town, on the southern tip of a long wooded island the natives called Manhattan. In the year 1700 AD, New York is barely a town at all, around 5,000 people pressed into the bottom mile of the island. Half a century earlier, it had carried a different name, New Amsterdam. And though the English seized it in 1664 and renamed it for their king's brother, the place is still half Dutch. You can hear it in the lanes, where the Dutch language is still spoken. You can see it in the houses, narrow, with steep crow-stepped gables of red and yellow brick, much of it carried over as ship's ballast from Holland, and an iron hoisting beam jutting from each peak to lift barrels into the attic. Pigs root through the muddy lanes. A single pond gives the town its water. A Dutch windmill grinds its wheat. And down at the island's tip, the old Dutch fort keeps its guns trained on a harbor crowded with masts. For here, everything begins and ends at the water. And along the town's northern edge runs the wall. In 1653 AD, the Dutch governor, Peter Stuyvesant, was certain the English were about to march down on him overland. So he ordered a barrier thrown up across the settlement's northern line, a ditch and a palisade of sharpened planks running the full width of the island, from the East River to the Hudson. More than 2,000 feet of timber, about 9 feet high. The men who dug that trench, swinging their tools from first light to last, were in good part the African laborers owned by the Dutch company. Men set down in the old records with names like Paulo d'Angola and Simon Congo. A wall built by people who were not free to keep the world out. The feared attack never came. In 1699 AD, the English pulled the wall down and sold off its timber and stone to help raise a new town hall. And the lane left behind, where the barrier had stood, they simply called Wall Street. Hold on to this half-mile of ground. Over the next 100 years, it is going to become something no one standing here could imagine. Let's go down through it, one layer at a time.
The first skin this street grew was trade.
New York had no gold and no great workshops. What it had was the harbor, one of the finest on the whole Atlantic coast, deep, sheltered, and slow to freeze. So the town lived by the sea. Better than 200 ships a year worked the East River wharves in a triangle that reached to Britain and above all to the sugar islands of the West Indies. Out went flour ground from the farms up the Hudson, timber, and horses. Back came sugar, molasses, and rum. Along the docks and in the coffee houses at the foot of Wall Street, merchants bought and sold English wool, Portuguese lemons, Jamaican rum, and human beings. Here is what few people expect of New York. By 1703 AD, more than 2 of every 5 households here owned at least one enslaved person. They were under a fifth of the town's people, yet no colonial city but Charleston held a higher share, and theirs was the largest enslaved population anywhere in the North. Their hands built the docks, loaded the ships, and served in the kitchens. And when the cramped little town reached for more room, it was enslaved labor that drove the new wharves out into the East River and packed the ground in behind them, so that the very shoreline of the city crept forward on the backs of the unfree. A great deal of New York's comfort and wealth rested quietly on the people it owned. And in 1711 AD, the city made that trade official. The Common Council decreed a public market for the buying and the hiring of slaves, and fixed it at the corner of Wall Street and the water's edge, beside the East River. It was a roofed wooden structure with a raised platform, where as many as 50 men, women, and children could be shown at one time, to be sold outright or rented by the day. It stood on that spot for half a century, until 1762. Now step back and look at what has happened to this ground. The same half-mile of earth that men like Paulo d'Angola had dug a lifetime before to wall the little town in had become the place where men like him were sold. The barrier raised by people who were not free was now a market in people who were not free. No one had planned it so. Layer by layer, it simply happened. But a town built on that much buying and selling would, sooner or later, produce someone willing to print what others would not say aloud. And he set up his press 1 block from the market.
With the salvaged timber and stone of the old wall.
The English had raised a new city hall at the head of Wall Street. And it is inside that building that the street grew its second skin, turning from a place that sold things into a place that made ideas. In 1733 AD, a poor German printer named John Peter Zenger began putting out a newspaper that attacked the colony's grasping royal governor without mercy. Under English law, that alone could destroy him, for to criticize those in power was a crime, even when every word you printed was true. In November of 1734 AD, he was arrested and held for nearly 10 months in a cell. And the press did not stop. His wife, Anna, kept the paper coming out week after week, taking his instructions through the gap beneath the prison door and running the type herself. In August of 1735 AD, Zenger came to trial in the hall built from the wall. His defense was taken up without a fee by the most celebrated lawyer in the colonies, Andrew Hamilton of Philadelphia. And he did something daring. He did not deny that his client had printed the words. Instead, he asked the jury to decide whether they were true, because he argued the truth cannot be a libel. The judge ordered him to stop. The jury listened anyway. They were gone 10 minutes and came back with 2 words: not guilty. No law was changed that day, but an idea had been planted. Decades later, a founding father, Gouverneur Morris, would call that verdict the morning star of the liberty that revolutionized America. And in that very same building, 30 years on, delegates from 9 colonies would gather to write, for the first time as one, a single defiant phrase: no taxation without representation. The street of the marketplace had become the street of the word. It had learned to sell, and it had learned to speak. What it did not yet know was that it was about to be conquered and burned.
By 1776, the town of 5,000 had swelled to some 25,000.
And that magnificent harbor made it the first great prize of the American Revolution. In the summer of that year, one of the largest fleets ever to cross the Atlantic appeared in the bay and put ashore the British general William Howe. Through August and September, his troops drove George Washington's army off Long Island and off Manhattan, and on the 15th of September they took the city. 6 days later, in the small hours of the 21st, fire broke out near a wharf at the island's tip. The town was roofed in cedar shingle and packed tight with timber houses, and a hard wind drove the flames north, lane by lane, until they had swallowed close to 500 buildings, a full quarter of the town.
At the very head of Wall Street, the tall wooden steeple of Trinity Church caught, blazed like a torch against the night, and collapsed into its own graveyard. To this day, no one has ever proven how the fire began. What rose from the ashes was stranger still. Over the burned-out cellars spread a shanty town of sailcloth tents, stitched together from old ship's canvas. People called it Canvas Town, and there thousands of the homeless lived for years among the blackened foundations. New York would be the only major American city held under enemy occupation for the entire length of the war. 7 years of military rule, red-coated regiments drilling past the ruins, the harbor thick with warships. The darkest corner of those years belonged to the prison hulks anchored off the Brooklyn shore, but that is a story of its own, and it touches this one only as a shadow at the edge of the water. Then, on the 25th of November 1783 AD, it ended. The last British regiments marched down to their waiting boats, but not without one final act of spite. They ran the King's flag up the pole at Fort George, then cut away the climbing cleats and greased the bare timber so that no rebel could raise the stars and stripes before their fleet had cleared the harbor. As the story is told, a young Army veteran named John Van Darsel nailed fresh cleats to the pole, hauled himself up hand over hand, and tore the British colors down just in time. Only then did George Washington ride in on horseback through a half-burned but finally free city. And now the wounded street was handed a future no one could have dreamed. The new nation, with no fixed capital of its own, chose New York as its first seat of government, and chose to house that government the same old City Hall on Wall Street, the building raised from the bones of the wall. A young French architect, Pierre L'Enfant, rebuilt it inside and out, a marble-floored hall, a vaulted chamber for the Congress, and a great columned portico crowned with a stone eagle opening onto a balcony high above Wall Street. It was among the first buildings raised in the new nation's own style. He gave it a new name too, Federal Hall. On the 30th of April 1789 AD, everything this ground had ever been, the wall, the market, the courtroom, the ruins, would hold up a single minute.
Come down, then, into the crowd, and stand on the ground where the wall once ran.
It is a gray Thursday morning, the 30th of April, 1789 AD. You are pressed shoulder to shoulder where Wall Street meets Broad, and above you every window and every rooftop is crowded with faces. The throng is enormous, the chronicles say 10,000, and it has gone strangely quiet. Out of that silence comes a single boom of cannon from the old fort down by the water. Onto the new balcony of Federal Hall steps a tall man in a plain suit of brown cloth, not European silk, but plain wool woven in the new country, with a dress sword at his side. George Washington. Beside him, the Chancellor of New York holds out the words of the oath. The Secretary of the Senate lifts a Bible on a crimson cushion. Washington lays his hand upon the book and speaks, and those near enough notice that his voice is low and grave and not quite steady. The hand of the most famous man in America is trembling. By tradition, it is said he added 3 words of his own, "So help me God," though the accounts written that day do not record them. What they record is the trembling. And then the roar. The Chancellor turns to the street, throws up his arm, and cries out, "Long live George Washington, President of the United States," and the half-mile erupts. Church bells in every rebuilt steeple, cannon answering from the harbor, 10,000 voices lifted on the very ground where a palisade once stood, where men and women had been sold from a wooden platform, where a jury had once spoken 2 quiet words. This strip of dirt has just become the beating heart of a new republic. The wall, the market, the courtroom, every old layer of it now holding up a single founding minute. And then, almost as quickly as it had come, the heart moved on. New York was the capital of the United States for barely 16 months. In 1790 AD, in a bargain struck over a private dinner between Jefferson, Hamilton, and Madison, the seat of government was traded away to the south, toward a stretch of Potomac marshland that would one day bear Washington's own name.
The clerks packed the records into crates. The grand new rooms of Federal Hall fell silent. The flags came down. And for a moment, it seemed the street had been handed its one great day, only to watch it walk away. The president was gone. The Congress was gone. What was left for a half-mile of ground once the glory had gone out the door? What was left was not in any marble hall. It was 1 block away, under a tree.
The young nation had borrowed heavily to pay for its war, and around those government bonds, a feverish new trade had grown.
Speculation. In the spring of 1792 AD, it collapsed into the country's first financial panic when one speculator's scheme to corner the market fell apart and dragged everything down with it. To steady the wreckage, the Treasury Secretary, Alexander Hamilton, had the government quietly buy up its own debt to hold prices firm. The first time the new federal government ever stepped in to rescue Wall Street. Out of that chaos came something almost absurdly simple. By now the street was no longer the muddy lane of 1700. It was paved, lined with 3-story houses of federal brick, and of the old walls line nothing at all remained but a single tree. On the 17th of May, 1792 AD, in front of number 68, in the shade of that lone sycamore, a buttonwood, 24 brokers signed half a sheet of paper carrying just 2 rules. They would trade only with one another and charge a fixed commission. No building, no marble, no balcony, only a tree and their word. And consider what this ground had been. A wall dug by the unfree to shut the world out. A market where people were bought and sold. A hall that crowned a republic and then let it go. And now, on the same strip of earth, 24 free men under a tree with nothing to put up but their word. And in that handshake, the seed of a market that would one day weigh the price of everything. That buttonwood stood until a storm brought it down in 1865 AD. By then, the tree was hardly needed. The street had long outgrown it. The barrier first dug to keep the world out had become, layer by patient layer, the one place the world was now desperate to get into.
New York was the capital of the new republic for just 16 months before it was traded away to the South.
The city that took its place was Philadelphia, a masterpiece engineered to outlive any disaster. If you want to see how the most carefully planned city in America was brought to its knees by an invisible fever, watch the Philadelphia Reconstruction next.
Subscribe to the channel, and let's keep reviving the past. See you on the next journey.
Before we finish, I want to take a moment to recognize the people appearing on screen right now. To the members of this channel, thank you so much. Your ongoing support is what motivates me and helps keep this project alive. If you enjoy what we do here and would like to directly support the channel, I invite you to click the Join button down below. To our members and to everyone who is simply watching this video, thank you for your time.